the church in the West, and you have that little colored map, we might refer to that occasionally. The church of the West, as we know, eventually split into far more than two segments, but from the Roman Catholic Church to the Lutheran Reformation, and then the rest of that whole Protestant Reformation. So, endless numbers of churches that became part of the church as it moved west with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But as we noted last week, the church, as it flowed to the east, also wound up in several different families of churches. We talked last time about the Oriental Orthodox churches and a little about the Nestorian so-called heretical church. And we're going to talk, I hope, my plan is if they can work it into the busy Zumbro schedule next winter, that we'll do another two-part schedule on the Greek Orthodox Church. We're not going to cover that this time, but that's another tremendously significant part of the Christian family. Split from Rome in 1054, east and west split, and we want to spend a couple of weeks on that, hopefully maybe late next February. Because that church started from Constantinople and gradually worked up through Bulgaria all the way up to Moscow. And there's that one interesting moment in time when the church in Rome was having a great deal of difficulty, considerable amount of difficulty. The church at Constantinople was finding great pressure from the move of Islam. And there were many Christians who thought there was one hope left for the center of Christian faith. And that would be in Moscow, Russia. That was really, that was part of history. So we're going to take a look at that probably sometime this winter. A few dates. If you like dates, you can jot them down on a little corner of the paper. 313 is an important date for Christians. We didn't talk about that last time, but in 313, Constantine, the emperor, still in Rome at that time, issued an edict in Milan that allowed Christians to have really a great say in the empire. Eventually became, of course, the majority faith of the Roman Empire and the Western Church. In 325, we talked last time about a council that was held at Nicaea. The early church struggled with many issues about how to understand the faith, and that was a big one, how to understand Jesus. Was there a time when he was not? And remember, out of that came the Nicene Creed, and we talked about that a little bit last time. Another date we might want to put down is 410. Rome was sacked, and it took Rome a long time to build up anything significant after that. Plus, sometime after 325, or about that time, Constantine moved the empire from Rome to Constantinople, and then changed the name. That's when it became Constantinople. And so that from that point on, for about 1,000 years, really, the center of life of the empire was out of Constantinople. You got that clear in your map? When you look at that little map, too, we use that because the reddish or, reddish type colors on that colored map indicate about the spread of the faith about through the 1st century. And the yellow colors indicate how the faith did move on with it for another 100 years, still almost about 200 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And one observation certainly has to be that it's the area of what we call the Holy Land and Asia Minor and Greece, a little bit down into Egypt, a couple of other spots in Carthage and all, and then a spot around Rome and a few dots in Spain. But that was sort of where we had the spread of the church through about that 2nd century. So now we've moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. Another date that we looked at last time was 451. The big issue for the church in that century became the person of Jesus. How to understand Jesus as both true God and true man. And I acknowledge that I haven't understood it. It's really, I think, a Greek language issue in terms of understanding the nature of how Jesus could be both God and man. And out of that controversy, we have a group of Christians sort of focused at first in Alexandria, Egypt. Then out of that flowed kind of the Oriental Orthodox Church. So the church in Egypt, the church then in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Armenia, Syria, India, those have all become part of an Oriental Orthodox they agreed at Chalcedon in terms of how they understood Jesus, true God and true man. That's a very significant church. I think I gave you a figure last time, about 50 million today that may belong to that Oriental Orthodox church. But there's another part of that church, and we talked about them last time, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more too. There was a man, Nestorius, that became Bishop of Constantinople. Some said he may have been gifted and talented, but he was very tactless. He could not quite accept the way the church was talking about Mary, and talking about Mary in order to preserve the holiness, divinity of Jesus. Remember, they had given Mary a new title, Theotokos. Mary is the bearer of God. Nestorius says that language is dangerous language. And so we explored what the Roman Catholic has pursued with Mary in terms of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and the bodily assumption of Mary. But at any rate, certainly the church that after Nestorius, there did become a large band of followers that accepted Nestorius' understanding of the faith, and they sort of became the Church of the East. Probably not a good name to call them the Nestorian Church, more the Church of the East, but they were non-Chalcedon people. The interesting thing that we talked about last time is that they took the gospel, the Nestorian people, all the way through Arabia, down through what we know today is Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and all the way, and I mentioned that in Xi'an, China, there's a stone marker about 10 feet tall that says in 635 AD, Christians came to China. And the stone marker indicates that, and is a very significant part of the life. Well, we're going to pick up the story a little bit now. In that 635, the Christians were in China, and 632, a man died that we're going to take a look at, whose life certainly has changed the course of history. A child by the name of Mohammed was born to a prominent Arab family of Mecca about the year 570 AD. The family was very vigorous in promoting a local shrine in Mecca, and I'm not sure, my Arabic isn't good, but the Kaaba. Have you seen pictures of this large black stone that pilgrims, when they come to Mecca, they move around it by the tens of thousands? Well, that stone, some say, goes back to the time of Abraham. It's an ancient stone. Well, this family that gave birth to the young boy Mohammed, they were sort of the promoters of this local shrine in Mecca. It was a time of great conflict in the Arabian Peninsula. There was an ancient dam at a place called Marib, M-A-R-I-B, that had collapsed, and it dramatically changed the climate, the whole cultural life of people in the Arabian Peninsula, and significantly affected many Orthodox Oriental people who had moved over to the Arabian Peninsula. Well, let's take a look at Mohammed. He grew and matured in about the year 610, and I figured he was about 40 years old. He then began to have visions and a revelation that he understood came from God, or as he referred to him, Allah. Mohammed began dictating those messages that he was getting by this divine revelation, or as he understood it, to a growing band of followers. And the result of that dictation was a written text that is the Qur'an. And I think properly spelled Q-U-R''A-N. We do it in our Americanized English eyes, K-O-R-A-N. Suffering some local oppression, Mohammed and his followers withdrew in the year 622 to Medina. And there he died 10 years later in 632. By then, 632, and he started getting his revelations in 610. By then, the Muslim religion was victorious and a very confident community. And from the very earliest times, certainly the Muslim faith was spread by force and conquest, but that is by no means the whole story as I have come to believe it historically. The spread of Islam is due to a lot more than brute force. So, let's take a look at the Quran and the the Islamic religion. The Qur'an literally means that which is to be recited. Have you seen maybe television pictures of gatherings of people in a setting in a mosque? They're all speaking. They're all reciting the Qur'an. They speak it. It's much more a spoken faith than it is a faith that you sit down and meditate in silence. I've noticed too the schools that we see in Pakistan, Afghanistan, of young Muslim children, they're all speaking the faith. They learn it by heart. The power of the text is exceptionally beautiful in Aramaic, I am told. It's extraordinary poetry in the Quran. It does not translate well into any other language, especially English. I remember years ago trying to read the Quran in English, and it was a very dull, boring experience. I don't know if some of you have tried it, but it was not terribly edifying. So it doesn't translate well. Since the beauty is in the text of the Quran, it's not necessary to represent God in holy pictures and images. And that's why they have never been taken very kindly to other religions that try to put the faith into images. Next winter, when we looked at the Greek Orthodox Church, that became a real controversy for the church with icons, you know, and the Orthodox Church with the icons. The Quran plays the same role in Islam that Jesus does in our faith. Think about that. The Quran has the same place for a Muslim as Jesus has for us. Does that explain why they were so offended by the Florida pastor that was going to burn a copy of the Quran? I think it helps to understand it at least. Another problem is that poetic language is always open to a lot of interpretations. Isn't that the beauty of poetry? You know, we can all read a poetic piece and see something quite different depending on our own experience. Part of the problem with the text of the Quran. And Islam does not have a hierarchy of clergy so that ultimately there's a kind of pope that says, no, this is what the text means. They do not have that in the Muslim tradition. So that consequently you get all kinds of imams who are coming out with these various declarations, sometimes very dangerous declarations, but they don't have that kind of control through a hierarchy for what is said. Interesting, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned twice as often in the Quran as she is in the Bible. Twice as often. One who's totally omitted from the Quran is the Apostle Paul. I have no idea why that's true, but it is. Here's what I found extremely interesting and I never thought about before. The Quran is a single book by one man written over a span of just a few years. What have you learned about the Bible? Written over hundreds of years by 66 books. I don't know how many authors. It took the church 2 centuries to even make a decision which books belonged in the Bible. Tremendous contrast.